Welcome to Void of Rules, where nightmares have no boundaries. In this channel, we explore the darkest corners of horror that most dare not enter. Every video takes you deeper into the shadows where forgotten terrors wait. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers by year's end. The void hungers for new souls. And now, let's dive into the void. The mountains swallowed the last bar of cell service as my rusty Honda climbed the winding forest road. 3 months of isolation stretched before me, a desperate escape from crushing student debt, and a freshly printed environmental science degree that had yet to open any doors. 2 weeks ago, I'd been drowning in rejection emails. Each morning brought fresh disappointment as entry-level positions went to applicants with more experience or better fit for corporate culture. My tiny apartment in Seattle felt like it was shrinking with each passing day, walls closing in as the final notices for student loan payments arrived with alarming regularity. Then the job listing had appeared like a mirage in my inbox. Fire lookout needed, immediate start, double standard pay, no experience required. The email came from an official government address, bearing the Forest Service logo, but something about the wording struck me as unusual. Most government job listings were buried under layers of bureaucratic language and qualification requirements. This one was direct, almost urgent. I should have questioned it, should have wondered why a position paying twice the standard rate remained unfilled at the beginning of fire season. Should have asked why they needed someone with no experience who could start immediately. But desperation makes fools of us all, and the promised salary would cover 6 months of loan payments. When I called the number, the voice on the other end asked only 3 questions. Can you start this weekend? Are you comfortable with extended isolation? Do you follow instructions precisely? I answered yes to all 3. And just like that, I was hired. No background check, no references, nothing about my qualifications to spot the first wisps of smoke that could devour thousands of acres. Just the strangest interview of my life, concluding with the caller's final words: pack for all weather conditions, bring no electronics besides a basic watch, tell only immediate family where you're going. The ranger station at the forest entrance was a weathered, wooden building with peeling green paint. Inside Head Ranger Dawson's office walls were plastered with topographical maps marked with cryptic symbols in faded red ink. He barely looked at my paperwork before sliding a metal key across his desk. Tower 7 is the most important position in our network, he said, his weathered face unreadable. The previous lookout left without proper notice. We've been blind in that sector for 17 days. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. When I asked about training, his laugh came out hollow. The manual covers everything you need to know, he said, handing me a worn leather binder. Follow it to the letter, no exceptions, no improvisations. His calloused finger tapped the cover for emphasis. Your life depends on it more than you realize. As we loaded my meager belongings into his Forest Service truck, I caught him making some kind of symbol across his chest. Not quite a religious gesture, but something protective, something ancient. One last thing, he said as the engine roared to life. If you decide this job isn't for you, you don't just leave, you radio me first. Promise me that. I promised, not understanding then why such a simple agreement seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders. The truck lurched forward, carrying us deeper into the whispering pines. With each mile marker, the shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just heading into the wilderness. We were crossing some invisible boundary, and whatever waited on the other side was already aware of my approach. The 2-hour drive deeper into the Cascades passed mostly in silence. Occasionally Ranger Dawson would point out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree that somehow still lived, a boulder formation called the Watchers, a creek that ran clear except during what he called the dark months. Tower 7 is different from the others, he eventually said, eyes fixed on the increasingly narrow road. Built in 1924 before the standardized designs. It sits on what the native tribes called the listening point. They never settled there, never hunted there. They only sent their shamans to that ridge during certain celestial alignments. I laughed nervously. Sounds like campfire stories to scare the new guy. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The Forest Service doesn't waste resources on superstition, Mr. Jenkins, but we do value institutional knowledge. The protocols for Tower 7 exist for reasons proven by experience. The truck rounded a final bend, and there it was, my home for the next 3 months. Unlike the modern steel and glass lookouts I'd researched online, Tower 7 was a massive wooden structure that seemed to grow from the ridge itself. Weathered cedar planks had turned silver grey with age. The observation cabin perched atop 4 crisscrossing supports that elevated it a full 60 feet above the ridge. A narrow staircase spiraled around the exterior, leading to the cabin above. "Those stairs are the only way up or down," Dawson said, parking the truck. "No rappelling equipment, no makeshift pulley systems, no exceptions." We unloaded my supplies. Enough food to last a month, water purification tablets, first aid kit, weather monitoring equipment, maps, reference guides and heavy-duty binoculars. As we climbed the stairs, each step creaked under our weight. The sound echoed strangely in the surrounding forest, as if something was listening. The observation cabin was surprisingly spacious, a square room about 20 feet on each side, with windows on all 4 walls providing a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. A bed occupied one corner, a small kitchen set up another. A desk with radio equipment faced north towards the distant ranger station. A potbelly stove sat cold in the center. "Standard protocols first," Dawson said, pointing to the radio. "Check in at 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. every day. No excuses. If you miss 2 check-ins consecutively, we send an extraction team." He walked me through the basic equipment, how to read weather instruments, spot smoke from different types of fires, and maintain daily logs of conditions and wildlife sightings. "Never leave the tower after sunset," he added. "Not for any reason. If there's a fire, you report it. You don't fight it. Your job is observation, not intervention." I nodded, taking mental notes. Nothing unusual so far. Just standard safety protocols for someone alone in the wilderness. Then Dawson reached into his jacket and removed a sealed red envelope. The paper was thick, almost like parchment, with emergency protocols written in formal script across the front. "This stays sealed unless specific circumstances arise," he said, placing it in a drawer beside the radio. "The circumstances are detailed in here." He tapped the leather binder he'd given me earlier. "Section 7, subsection 3. My curiosity piqued. I flipped open the binder. The front pages contained standard operating procedures, radio protocols, fire classification systems, wildlife identification guides. But as I progressed, the instructions grew increasingly specific and strange. "If you see lights moving in specific patterns between trees, close all shutters for exactly 47 minutes, I read aloud. "What does that mean? What patterns?" "The patterns are diagrammed on page 32, Dawson replied matter-of-factly. "You'll need to memorize them." I flipped further. "If the radio plays static at 3:17 p.m, do not acknowledge it or respond. Continue as if nothing happened." I looked up. "Is this a joke?" His expression hardened. "Does this look like a man who jokes, Jenkins?" I continued reading. "If you spot a deer with unusual antler configurations, document it but never photograph it. If you hear your name called from the forest, ignore it completely, regardless of the voice." The rules went on. Birds flying in perfect circles was apparently a warning sign. I should never describe my physical appearance over the radio to anyone, even headquarters. And if I dreamed of a wooden door 3 nights in a row, I should request immediate extraction. "This is crazy," I said, closing the binder. Crazy keeps you alive up here, Dawson replied. He checked his watch. I need to leave before sunset, read the entire manual tonight. Memorize the protocols. Whatever you do, don't improvise. He headed for the stairs, then paused. One last thing, the logs from previous lookouts are in the storage closet. Reading them might help contextualize things. Before I could ask anything else, he was clomping down the wooden stairs. 10 minutes later, the sound of his truck faded into the distance, and I was alone. More alone than I'd ever been in my life. The first week passed peacefully. The daily routine was simple but satisfying. I'd wake at dawn to watch the sunrise paint the mountain slopes gold. After breakfast, I'd perform weather readings, scan the horizons for smoke, and check in with base camp at precisely 9 a.m. The radio operator, a friendly woman named Val, would take my report and occasionally share news from the outside world. Jenkins at Tower 7, check-in complete, Val would respond. All quiet on the Western Front today. She never asked personal questions or engaged in casual conversation like I expected. Just business with the occasional weather update or news snippet. When I tried to ask about the unusual protocols, she smoothly changed the subject or claimed radio interference. I spent my mornings mapping the visible terrain, memorizing every ridge and valley within my sightline. The tower's location offered commanding views of almost 30 miles of wilderness in every direction. To the north, alpine meadows rolled into dense pine forests. Eastward, jagged mountain peaks cut into the sky like broken teeth. The southern view encompassed a vast canyon system where ravens rode thermals in lazy spirals, and to the west, more forest stretched toward distant lakes that gleamed like mirrors in the afternoon sun. By my fourth day, I'd spotted elk, black bears, a mountain lion, and countless smaller mammals. Each sighting went into the logbook with precise timestamps and behavior notes. I found myself slipping into the role with surprising ease, developing a rhythm that made the hours flow smoothly. Midday was reserved for tower maintenance and meal preparation. The previous lookout had left the place reasonably clean, but neglected certain repairs. I fixed loose floorboards, resealed window frames against the mountain winds, and reorganized the supply closet according to the manual's specifications. The work kept my hands busy, while my mind processed the isolation. Afternoons were for observation and reading. I brought several novels and field guides, but found myself increasingly drawn to the leather binder of protocols. Some sections read like poetry in their strangeness. When fog obscures the northern quadrant but no other, speak to no one until it clears. Record each minute of fog duration in the logbook, using red ink only. If a single pine cone lands on the observation deck, with no wind present, place it in the metal box beneath the stove. Do not burn it. Dreams of falling indicate heightened activity. Record all falling dreams and place a stone at each corner of the tower base at dawn. The evenings were mine to enjoy. After my 7 p.m. check-in, I'd cook dinner on the small propane stove and eat, while watching the sunset transform the landscape. As darkness fell, the stars emerged in stunning clarity. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled sugar, and shooting stars were nightly occurrences. Without light pollution, the night sky revealed its true majesty. Layers upon layers of stars, cosmic dust clouds, and occasionally the aurora dancing along the northern horizon. I developed little rituals to pass the time. I'd pick a constellation and trace its shape with my finger against the window. I'd name the peaks visible from each window, inventing stories about how they got their shapes. I'd write letters I knew I'd never send, describing the perfect silence of true wilderness. In these quiet moments, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The crushing anxiety of job hunting and debt had faded to a distant memory. Here, success had simple metrics: spot smoke, report accurately, follow protocols. No performance reviews, no office politics, no crushing social media comparisons. Despite the strange rules in the manual, nothing unusual happened. I began to suspect the protocols were either outdated superstitions or an elaborate hazing ritual for new lookouts. Maybe veteran rangers amused themselves by inventing increasingly bizarre instructions for gullible newcomers. Some rules seemed designed specifically to mess with an isolated person's mind, like the directive to count backwards from 100. In whispers, if you see your own reflection, move independently. Either way, the job was a dream, paid solitude in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. I even began noting potential locations for a small cabin, indulging fantasies of saving enough money to build my own retreat in the wilderness someday. On the 7th night, I fell asleep to the gentle patter of rain on the roof, the manual open beside me, to a section titled Nocturnal Boundary Events. My last conscious thought was wondering why anyone would waste time inventing such elaborate fictions for a simple fire lookout job. On the 8th day, I noticed the first oddity. Around noon, the forest below my tower fell completely silent. Not gradually, as happens when a predator passes through, but instantaneously, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the world. No birds, no insects, not even the perpetual whisper of wind through pines. For 17 minutes I stood frozen at the window, straining to hear anything. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound returned, but wrong somehow, like an out-of-sync audio track. I almost mentioned it during my evening check-in, but decided against it. It was probably just a weather phenomenon I didn't understand yet. The next morning, I spotted 7 crows flying in a perfect circle above a clearing about 2 miles east of my tower. I remembered the manual's warning about circular flight patterns and dutifully noted the direction and number in my log. Nothing happened afterwards, but my neck tingled all day, as if someone was standing just behind me. On the 10th day, I experienced my first major rule trigger. At precisely 3:17 p.m, the radio emitted a burst of static. Following protocol, I ignored it and continued updating my weather logs. The static continued, gradually forming into something that resembled whispers. I couldn't make out words exactly, but the cadence was conversational, as if multiple voices were discussing something just below the threshold of comprehension. My first instinct was to adjust the frequency or check the connections. The manual was explicit about radio maintenance. Any malfunction required immediate documentation and repair. But this particular static at this specific time matched the protocol warning exactly. So, instead of fixing the problem, I was supposed to ignore it. The pencil in my hand felt suddenly heavy as I forced myself to continue recording cloud patterns as if nothing unusual was happening. The whispers intensified, becoming more distinct without becoming more comprehensible. They reminded me of standing outside a crowded room, hearing the music of conversation without distinguishing words. Occasionally a syllable would rise above the others, sharp and clear for just a moment before dissolving back into the audio soup. Then, one whisper rose above the others, speaking my name. Not Jenkins, as Dawson called me, but Michael, my first name, which I hadn't shared with anyone at the Forest Service. The cold precision of that whisper froze me in place. The pencil slipped from my fingers and rolled across the desk. "Michael," the voice repeated, stretching the syllables unnaturally. "We know you're listening, Michael." The whisper knew other things too. The name of my childhood dog, the address of my first apartment, the words my mother had said to me the day before she died. Intensely private things I'd never documented anywhere. The voice quoted from an angry letter I'd written but never sent after my college girlfriend left me. It recited the exact words of a prayer I'd whispered alone at my father's funeral. "We've been waiting for you specifically, Michael Jenkins," the whisper continued. its tone a grotesque parody of friendliness. The others weren't right, not like you. You could be so much more than just a lookout. We could show you things. Just acknowledge us, just one word. That's all it would take. Other voices joined in, each offering something different. Wealth, knowledge, revenge against those who had wronged me. Each temptation crafted with intimate knowledge of my deepest desires and resentments. Promises that became increasingly specific and increasingly enticing. For 8 excruciating minutes I forced myself to continue working, acting as if I heard nothing. My hands shook so badly I could barely write. Sweat dripped onto the weather log, smudging the pencil marks. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain the entities on the radio could hear it. "We can wait," the main voice finally said as the static began to diminish. "We're very patient, Michael. We've been here long before your kind arrived. We'll be here long after. But you won't always be protected by those rules. Rules can be broken. Rules can be reinterpreted." When the static finally cut out at 3:25 p.m, I collapsed into my chair, drenched in sweat. My throat felt raw, though I hadn't made a sound. The pencil I'd been holding had snapped in two, and I'd somehow driven one half deep enough into my palm to draw blood. A perfect circle of red, like a period ending a sentence. That evening, I spotted the lights, exactly as diagrammed on page 32. Pinpricks of blue-white illumination moving between distant trees in a pattern that resembled a flowing script. I slammed the shutters closed and secured them, then sat in the darkness, counting seconds until the 47-minute period elapsed. Something climbed the tower during those 47 minutes. I heard the stairs creaking in a rhythm that matched no human gait. Too many steps, too quickly for a normal stride. It circled the cabin several times, testing each window and shutter. Then came the scratching, long, deliberate drags across the wooden walls, like oversized claws marking territory. When exactly 47 minutes had passed, I reopened the shutters. The forest was normal again, but in the moonlight, I could see fresh marks in the wooden railing of the stairs, 5 parallel grooves cut deep into the weathered cedar. 2 weeks into my stay, I made my first mistake. A juvenile black bear wandered into a clearing near the tower, nothing unusual except for a distinctive white patch on its chest. According to the manual, such markings required immediate documentation. I began the entry in my wildlife log but was interrupted by an urgent radio call about a possible smoke sighting. In the excitement, I forgot to complete the bear documentation. The next morning, I awoke to find my coffee mug on the opposite side of the room from where I'd left it. My boots were neatly arranged, facing the door, rather than the bed. The pages in the leather binder had been rearranged, nothing missing, just in a different order. Most disturbing of all, my supply of fresh food had spoiled overnight. Meat turned grey, fruit collapsed into mush, bread covered in blue-black mould. That night, I dreamed of a wooden door standing alone in a forest clearing. It was ancient oak, bound with black iron, with no frame or wall. Just a door standing impossibly on its own. In the dream, I knew with terrifying certainty that I must never open it. Yet my hand kept reaching for the handle against my will. I woke gasping just before my fingers touched the cold iron. The radio connection to headquarters became increasingly unreliable. Val's voice would cut out mid-sentence, replaced by periods of silence or strange background noises that sounded like chanting. The weather around the tower behaved erratically. Localized rain showers that fell only on the tower itself. Fog that formed geometric patterns before dissipating. Clouds that moved against the wind. On the 17th day, I spotted smoke rising from a distant ridge, an area unmarked on my maps. I reported it to Val, who sounded confused. "There's no lookout tower in that sector, Jenkins," she said. "Are you sure about those coordinates?" I confirmed the location 3 times. Val put me on hold, then returned sounding oddly formal. Our records show no fire activity in that area. Continue regular monitoring protocols. But the smoke continued rising day after day. Using my binoculars, I eventually made out a structure similar to my own tower, silhouetted against the sunset. Occasionally I glimpsed movement in its observation cabin, a figure watching me through binoculars of their own. One morning I woke to find a crude map drawn in the condensation on my window, a line connecting my tower to the mysterious, distant structure. The map included markings similar to the symbols I'd seen on Dawson's wall maps. I copied it into my personal notebook before wiping the window clean. The second major rule trigger occurred on day 21. I was outside on the observation deck when I heard someone calling my name from the forest below. It was my father's voice, distinctive and unmistakable, despite his being dead for 5 years. "Michael, help me, I'm hurt down here." The voice was so convincing, I nearly responded, before remembering the rule. I gripped the railing until my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to remain silent. The voice changed tactics. Now it was my college girlfriend pleading for help. Then my best friend from high school. Then my mother, crying that she was lost in the woods. Each voice knew exactly what to say to trigger my deepest protective instincts. After an hour of psychological torture, the voices finally stopped. The next morning, I found fresh scratches on the tower stairs. Not the parallel marks from before, but a single continuous line spiraling up the entire staircase, as if something with one massive claw had climbed while dragging it against the wood. That night, I dreamed of the door again. This time, I could hear muffled voices behind it, familiar voices calling my name. I woke before touching the handle, but just barely. With increasing dread, I realized I needed to learn more about what was happening. The storage closet Dawson had mentioned might hold answers. I'd avoided it until now, partly from being busy with duties and partly from subconscious fear of what I might find. The closet was small, just 4 feet deep and lined with shelves of supplies. At first glance, nothing unusual, just extra equipment, maintenance tools, and emergency rations. But when I removed a stack of blankets from the bottom shelf, I discovered the panel. It was cut into the back wall, nearly invisible, except for a slight gap around the edges. I pried it open to reveal a hidden compartment stuffed with personal effects, watches, wallets, photographs, journals, belongings of previous lookouts, hidden away like evidence. With trembling hands, I extracted the journals and began reading. The oldest dated back to 1943. The most recent was from last year, presumably belonging to my immediate predecessor. Each told a similar story. Initial skepticism about the rules, growing unease as strange phenomena manifested, and eventual terror as rules were broken, intentionally or accidentally. The journals revealed patterns. Minor rule violations led to subtle consequences, escalating with each infraction. Major violations resulted in direct encounters with what the writers variously called forest entities, the Watchers, or simply them. Some lookouts describe bargains offered by the entities, promises of wealth, knowledge, or power in exchange for access. Several journals ended abruptly mid-entry. Others contained frantic final pages describing extraction attempts that failed when the forest itself seemed to intervene. The most disturbing entries suggested that the Fire Lookout Service wasn't primarily concerned with fires at all. One journal from 1967 contained the phrase, "We're not here to watch for fires, we're here to maintain the boundary. The towers form a containment perimeter. We're guards, not lookouts." My predecessor's journal was particularly unsettling. The writer had discovered that the emergency protocols envelope contained information about the true purpose of Tower 7. They had planned to open it despite not meeting the criteria. believing the rules were manipulative control tactics rather than protection measures. The final entry read, "I'm leaving tonight. The envelope is a lie. The whole system is designed to use us as sacrifices to contain something that shouldn't exist. If you're reading this, get out now." That night, I dreamed of the door for the third consecutive time. In this dream, I stood before it as it bulged outward, wood splintering as something massive pressed against the other side. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding. According to protocol, 3 consecutive door dreams meant I should request immediate extraction. I tried the radio at my scheduled 9 AM check-in. Nothing but static. I tried every frequency, emergency channels included. The silence was absolute, except for an occasional distant sound like laughter. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the forest, despite the weather instruments predicting clear skies. The temperature in the tower plummeted until I could see my breath. A strange growth appeared on the exterior walls, not moss or lichen, but something that resembled black veins spreading through the wood. At night I heard a constant movement on the observation deck, footsteps circling the cabin for hours without pause. My situation was desperate. The protocols stated clearly what I should do after 3 door dreams, but with no radio communication, extraction was impossible. I was trapped in a tower that felt increasingly alive and hostile, surrounded by a forest filled with entities that wanted something from me. I had only one option left, the emergency envelope. My hands shook as I removed it from the drawer. Breaking this rule felt momentous, irreversible, but I had no choice. I tore open the red seal and emptied the contents onto my desk. Inside was a yellowed photograph from the 1920s showing 5 men standing before the newly constructed Tower 7. Their expressions were grim, determined. I recognized the location but was struck by the difference in the surrounding forest. The trees were smaller, less dense, as if reluctant to approach the tower. The second item was a letter on formal Forest Service letterhead, dated 1923, to the lookout of Tower 7. If you are reading this, conventional containment protocols have failed. The boundary is weakening. You now require the complete truth to survive and perform your duty. Tower 7 was never primarily a fire lookout station. It is one of 7 anchors in a containment system designed to restrict entities that existed in this region long before human settlement. These entities cannot be destroyed by conventional means, but are bound by certain rules and limitations we have exploited to create a form of imprisonment. The native tribes maintained this containment through blood rituals for centuries before our arrival. When tuberculosis decimated their shamans in the 1870s, the boundary weakened. The Forest Service construction of lookout towers in the 1920s was our attempt to reinforce containment using modern methods while disguising our true purpose. The entities seek passage through specific doorways between their realm and ours. Tower 7 stands upon one such doorway. The protocols you've been following maintain the integrity of our anchor points, but when multiple rules are broken, the boundary weakens substantially. If extraction is impossible and the boundary is failing, you must perform the renewal ritual described on the enclosed page. Be warned, this ritual requires personal sacrifice. The boundary demands payment in blood, freely given. Should you choose to abandon your post without performing this ritual, the consequences will extend far beyond this forest. The entities will establish new doorways wherever they please. You did not choose this burden knowingly, and for that deception I apologize. But you are now the only person who can prevent a breach that would threaten thousands of lives. With deepest regret and respect, William Dorchester, Regional Forester, 1923. The final item was a single page detailing the renewal ritual, a complex procedure involving specific movements, spoken phrases in a language I didn't recognize, and culminating in a blood offering made at precise points around the tower's foundation. The handwritten instructions included detailed diagrams showing exact positions, timing, and the specific sequence of actions required. Footnotes in the margins, added in different handwriting over decades, offered clarifications and warnings based on previous lookouts' experiences. The ritual description didn't name the language used in the spoken components, but the phonetic transcription reminded me of recordings I'd heard of Salishan languages indigenous to the Pacific Northwest. The words themselves seemed designed to be difficult for human mouths to pronounce, with combinations of sounds that strained the limits of vocal anatomy. Most disturbing were the illustrations showing the precise locations and depths of the 7 cuts required for the blood offering. These weren't superficial ceremonial nicks. They were positioned over specific veins and arteries to ensure proper blood flow. One notation explicitly stated, "The boundary feeds on intent as much as blood. Hesitation weakens the seal. Conviction strengthens it." As I read the ritual instructions, the phenomena around the tower intensified. The temperature dropped until frost formed inside the windows, despite the summer heat outside. The black veins in the wood pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, expanding and contracting with each pump of my heart. The structure groaned and shifted as if under immense pressure, timbers bending at angles that should have broken them. The air grew thick and viscous, making each breath a struggle. Strange distortions warped the view through the windows, trees stretching impossibly tall before snapping back to normal size, the ground rippling like water, colours shifting beyond their natural spectrum. Outside, the forest had gone completely dark at midday, as if night had fallen prematurely. But this darkness had texture. It writhed and twisted with subtle movement, occasionally revealing glimpses of something vast moving within it. The radio crackled to life without my touching it, broadcasting a cacophony of overlapping voices, some pleading, some threatening, some speaking in languages that hurt my ears. The voices grew increasingly frantic, as if they knew what I was planning. "Don't do this," one voice warned with eerie clarity. "The ritual is a lie. It binds you more than us. You become part of the boundary forever." Another seemed to speak directly into my mind. "We can offer a better way. A door that leads to freedom for both of us. Just wait. Just hesitate." I had no choice. I gathered the required materials, a knife from the kitchen drawer. The instructions specified iron, not steel. Salt, coarse kosher salt, not table salt. Pine resin from the storage closet, collected during the spring equinox according to a label. And 7 red candles I found hidden behind the panel where I'd discovered the journals. Each candle was partially burned, suggesting they'd been used in previous rituals and carefully preserved. The final component was chalk, made from ground animal bone, stored in a small wooden box carved with symbols, matching those on Dawson's maps. This would be used to draw the containment circle around the tower's base. The ritual had to be performed outside, at the base of the tower, when the boundary was at its weakest, which, according to the instructions, would be signalled by the stillness before breach. The notation explained this moment would be unmistakable. All natural sound ceases. The entities pause in anticipation. The air feels like glass about to shatter. I memorized the key phrases and movements, knowing there would be no opportunity to consult the instructions once I began. My hands trembled as I gathered the materials into a small pack. The knife, an old thing, with a bone handle that I'd initially mistaken for part of the kitchen equipment, felt unnaturally heavy, as if it understood its purpose. That moment came at sunset. One instant, the forest was filled with an unnatural wind that howled around the tower. The next, absolute silence fell like a physical weight. I knew instinctively this was my only chance. I descended the stairs slowly, knife in hand. Each step felt like moving through molasses, as if the air itself resisted my motion. At the base of the tower, I arranged the candles in the specified pattern and began the ritual. The ancient words felt wrong in my mouth, like swallowing stones, but I recited them exactly as written. As I completed each phase, the air around me thickened and distorted, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but more substantial, more intentional. Then came the final step, the blood offering. The instructions required 7 cuts, 1 for each candle, made in a specific sequence. The blood had to be given freely, with full understanding of its purpose. As I prepared to make the first cut, the forest around me transformed. The trees stretched and twisted into impossible forms, bark spiraling and peeling away to reveal surfaces that resembled both flesh and metal simultaneously. Pine and needles elongated into filaments that waved without wind, each tip glowing with a cold blue light. The ground rippled like water, forming concentric circles that emanated outward from where I stood. The sky fractured like broken glass, revealing not stars or void, but something like an enormous eye composed of countless smaller eyes, all blinking out of synchronization. The air itself seemed to develop texture, becoming grainy in some places, slick in others, as if reality were a poorly maintained film jumping in its projector. And in the distorted space between the trees, I glimpsed them, the entities. They defied comprehensive description. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing, constantly reinterpreting their forms as if trying to force them into recognizable shapes. They existed partially in our reality, partially elsewhere, like 3-dimensional shadows of 4-dimensional beings. What I could perceive seemed to be composed of negative space, not darkness, but the absence of anything recognizable as matter or energy. Where they moved, reality didn't just bend. It ceased to exist temporarily, creating undulating holes in the fabric of existence itself. These voids had edges that hurt to look at directly, not because they were bright or dark, but because they represented angles and intersections that couldn't exist in our geometry. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested countless limbs, or perhaps no limbs at all, their forms constantly shifting between states that resembled smoke, liquid, solid, and something else entirely that had no name in human language. One moment, an entity would appear almost humanoid. The next, it would expand into something resembling an enormous jellyfish made of holes in space, then contract into a spinning configuration of interlocking rings. And they were vast, far larger than the forest could possibly contain, yet somehow folded into our reality, like origami creations of impossible complexity. I sensed that what I perceived was merely a tiny projection of their true forms, like how a 3-dimensional object casts a 2-dimensional shadow. Some seemed ancient and patient, while others felt chaotic and hungry. They communicated not through sound, but through patterns of distortion in the air between them, ripples of meaning that occasionally washed over me, with fragments of emotion so alien I couldn't name them. Emotions that humans were never meant to feel. I understood in that moment what the native shamans had recognized centuries ago. These entities weren't malevolent in any human sense. They had no hatred for humanity, no desire to conquer or destroy as we understand those concepts. They were simply incompatible with our reality. Their mere presence warped the fundamental laws of our universe: gravity, time, causality, the distinction between matter and energy. Prolonged exposure to them would unravel the fabric of our existence like pulling a loose thread from a sweater. They were drawn to our world not out of malice, but out of something like curiosity or hunger or neither, attracted to consciousness like moths to flame, not understanding that their touch would extinguish the very light that drew them. They didn't want to destroy our world. They simply couldn't exist alongside it without transforming it into something uninhabitable for beings like us. As I stood there, knife in hand, I felt them become aware of me, not as an individual, but as a component of the boundary that contained them. I felt their collective attention shift, focusing with an intensity that threatened to shatter my sanity. Some projected what I interpreted as offers, others threats, still others simply observed with alien curiosity. With this understanding, I made the cuts, 7 in total, each accompanied by words that seemed to anchor the blood's purpose to the boundary. Each drop that fell to the earth flared with momentary light before sinking into the ground. The entities recoiled from this light, their knot forms contracting away from the tower's base. As I completed the final cut, a shockwave expanded outward from the tower. The distortions receded. The entities withdrew like a tide returning to the ocean. The forest slowly resumed its normal appearance, though the trees seemed more densely packed around the perimeter, as if forming a natural barrier to reinforce what I had just rebuilt. I collapsed at the base of the tower, weak from blood loss and the psychological toll of what I'd witnessed. As consciousness faded, I heard the radio in the cabin above crackle to life, Val's voice calling my name with genuine concern. I awoke in a hospital bed 2 days later. Ranger Dawson sat beside me, his weathered face showing what might have been respect. "You performed the ritual," he said. It wasn't a question. "You knew this would happen," I replied, my voice hoarse. "You knew the previous lookout had abandoned their post without completing the ritual. You sent me in there knowing I might have to face them." Dawson nodded slowly. "We needed someone who would follow the rules precisely, who would turn to the protocols when things went wrong instead of fleeing. Your psychological profile suggested you were ideal. You used me. We gave you a choice, same as every lookout. You could have left when things got strange. Many do. But those who stay, who complete the ritual when necessary, they become part of something essential." He leaned forward. "The boundary needs guardians, Jenkins. People who understand what's at stake." A doctor entered, interrupting our conversation. As they checked my vitals, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a metal cabinet. My appearance had subtly changed. Nothing dramatic, but my eyes seemed deeper set. My skin tone slightly altered, as if part of me had been permanently marked by the encounter. 3 days later, I was discharged. Dawson was waiting for me in the hospital lobby. "The Forest Service offers a different position to those who've performed the ritual," he said, handing me an envelope. "Training specialist. Better pay. More comfortable quarters. You'd help prepare new lookouts, teach them to recognize signs, impress upon them the importance of following protocols." "Without telling them the whole truth," I said. Dawson's expression hardened. "Would you have taken the job if you'd known? Would anyone—" He had a point. But more than that, I felt a strange connection to Tower 7 now, as if part of me remained there, bound to the boundary I'd renewed with my blood. I knew instinctively that the forest would call me back eventually, ritual or no ritual. 1 month later, I found myself driving a Forest Service truck up that same winding road, a nervous college graduate beside me. Tower 7 needed a new lookout, and I'd been tasked with their orientation. My new role within the Forest Service carried an innocuous title, Special Resources Training Coordinator, but everyone in the inner circle knew what it meant. I was a recruiter, a screener, a preparer of sacrifices. The young woman beside me fidgeted with her backpack straps, eyes wide with excitement as she gazed at the towering pines. Emily Kowalski, 23, environmental science major like I had been. Her personnel file sat between us on the seat, psychological evaluation indicating rule-adherent personality, high tolerance for isolation, and responsive to authority structures. All the same markers that had made me an ideal candidate. I studied her from the corner of my eye as we drove, noting her wonder at the scenery, her eager questions about wildlife and botany. She'd come from Chicago, had never spent more than a weekend camping. Perfect. Those with wilderness experience asked too many questions about why certain protocols contradicted standard practices. My reflection in the windshield caught my attention momentarily. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. My eyes had darkened to an almost obsidian hue. Fine lines radiated from their corners. Not wrinkles, but something more deliberate, like tiny roots extending outward. My skin had taken on a faintly ashen undertone. Most people wouldn't notice anything unusual, but those who had performed the ritual would recognize the marks immediately. "The job is pretty straightforward," I told the young woman as we approached the ranger station. "Mostly observation and reporting. There are some special protocols for this particular tower, but nothing too complicated." She nodded eagerly, clearly thrilled by the adventure ahead, unaware of what waited at the listening point. I still can't believe how lucky I was to get this position. The pay is amazing, and I've always wanted to experience true wilderness. I smiled thinly. Luck had nothing to do with it. You were selected. I let the word hang between us, meaningless to her, but heavy with significance to those who understood the system. The ranger station came into view, and I saw Dawson watching from the window. He nodded almost imperceptibly as we parked. He would perform his role in the charade, reviewing basic protocols, issuing standard equipment, playing the gruff but caring supervisor. Later, after I'd taken Emily to the tower, he would radio with updates and special instructions that would begin the real indoctrination process. As Emily stepped out to stretch her legs, Dawson approached me while she was out of earshot. "How's the connection?" he asked quietly. I knew what he meant. The boundary entities remained aware of me at all times now, a constant presence at the periphery of my consciousness, like the hum of fluorescent lights or the sound of one's own breathing. Usually background noise, but occasionally surging forward with alien thoughts and impressions. "Stable," I replied. "They're curious about her. They can sense her through me already." Dawson nodded grimly. "Good candidate." "Perfect. Rule follower. Isolated. Eager to please authority figures. Like you were." Not a question. I ignored the comment. "We should get moving if we want to reach the tower before sunset." As we continued our journey after the brief stop, Emily peppered me with questions about daily routines and wildlife sightings. I answered mechanically, my attention divided between her and the growing awareness of the boundary weakening as we approached Tower 7. The entities were stirring, their attention focused on our approach. "One thing though," I said, interrupting her mid-question about bears, my voice taking on the same cadence Dawson had used with me. "If you decide this job isn't for you, you don't just leave, you radio me first. Promise me that." She promised easily, not understanding the weight of those words. Of course, I wouldn't want to leave you guys in the lurch during fire season. As we continued deeper into the forest, I felt the entities stirring at the edge of my awareness, watching, waiting, testing the boundary that held them back. They recognized me now. Part of them lived in my blood, just as part of me existed in their realm. And through our connection, they had already begun to taste Emily's consciousness, sampling her fears, her desires, her particular vulnerabilities. They would craft their temptations specifically for her, just as they had for me. I wondered briefly if this cycle of recruitment and sacrifice was ethical, luring unsuspecting people into becoming living components of an ancient containment system. But the alternative was unthinkable. I'd glimpsed what awaited beyond the boundary. The entities contained here were merely the equivalent of curious children pressing against a window. The full force of their kind would remake our reality into something humanity couldn't survive, so the deception would continue, The rules would be followed. The boundary would hold. "We're almost there," I said as the truck rounded the final bend. "You'll see the tower any moment now." Emily gasped as Tower 7 came into view, silhouetted against the setting sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed, though I was looking not at the tower but at the almost imperceptible distortions in the air around it. Ripples in reality where the boundary had been repaired by my blood. "It's quite something." We unloaded her supplies and began the climb up those familiar stairs. With each step, I felt the entity's attention intensify. They remembered these stairs. They remembered the ritual. They remembered my blood, and they were hungry for more. I would begin Emily's orientation with the standard protocols. Then, gradually, I would introduce the special rules. I would watch carefully to see how she responded to each escalation, assessing whether she would flee at the first sign of strangeness, or remain until the boundary required renewal once more. The cycle would continue, the boundary would hold, and I would train the guardians needed to maintain it, one lookout at a time, until the Forest Service found a more permanent solution, or until the entities finally broke through. As we reached the observation cabin, I handed Emily the leather-bound manual that had changed my life. "Everything you need to know is in here," I said, echoing Dawson's words. "Follow it to the letter. No exceptions, no improvisations." My finger tapped the cover for emphasis, leaving a smudge that momentarily shimmered, with an oily iridescence before fading into the leather. "Your life depends on it more than you realize. Some jobs change you forever. Mine transformed me into something both more and less than human, a guardian of a boundary between worlds, marked by powers older than civilization. All because I took a job as a fire lookout in the woods, where the rules weren't suggestions but survival."